You think the Mafia is a thing of the past, a relic of black and white movies and faded history books. Think again. Right now, this very moment, the Mafia and its cousins across the world are pulling invisible strings that shape the way you live. From the coffee you drink in the morning, to the construction of skyscrapers, to the drugs traded on your streets, the hidden economy of crime is bigger, richer, and more powerful than most of us could ever imagine. And here's the shocking truth. Experts estimate that organized crime controls up to 3% of the entire world's GDP. That's trillions of dollars. More money than many countries' annual budgets combined. But unlike governments, the Mafia doesn't run on laws. It runs on fear, loyalty, and cold, ruthless business sense. The story of the Mafia begins in the dusty villages of Sicily in the 19th century. What started as small protection groups for farmers and merchants quickly transformed into something far darker. When the Sicilian Mafia crossed the ocean into the United States, it merged with prohibition, smuggling, and gambling to create an empire of fear and respect. Names like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and John Gotti became legends, not just for their crimes, but for the shadow they cast over entire societies. But here's what most people miss. The Mafia didn't die when law enforcement cracked down in the 1980s and 90s. It adapted, it evolved, it went underground, and in some ways it grew stronger. Because when one criminal empire falls, another rises to take its place. And today, the Mafia is not just Italian. It has cousins everywhere. The Yakuza in Japan, the triads in China, the cartels of Latin America, and the Russian mob. Different cultures, different names, but the same hidden economy of crime. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Maybe organized crime is out there, but it doesn't affect me. The truth, it affects all of us. The Mafia doesn't just deal in guns and drugs anymore. They run construction companies, waste management firms, import-export businesses, and even invest in cryptocurrency. They launder billions of dollars through banks that you might trust. They influence politicians, infiltrate police departments, and control unions. The Mafia has moved from the shadows of alleyways into the very boardrooms of the modern world. And sometimes they step into roles we don't expect. When governments collapse, when wars erupt, when crises leave people desperate, it is often organized crime groups that fill the vacuum. They provide protection, loans, jobs, and services, always at a cost. In many parts of the world, people trust the Mafia more than they trust their own governments. In this documentary, we're going to peel back the layers of this hidden empire. We'll uncover how the Mafia went from back alley enforcers to global business magnates. We'll look at how they make their billions, what industries they secretly control, and why it's so hard even for the most powerful governments to shut them down. And finally, we'll ask the most important question of all. In the 21st century, can the Mafia actually be stopped, or will they continue to thrive, quietly shaping the world around us? This is not just the story of criminals. This is the story of money, power, and survival. The Mafia isn't dead. It never was. It simply traded bullets for billions. And now it's time to uncover the truth. Blood and roots, the origins of the Mafia, to understand the power of the Mafia today. We have to go back to a time when Italy was broken, lawless, and desperate. The Mafia was not born as a criminal empire. It began as a response to chaos, as groups of armed men offering protection in exchange for loyalty. But very quickly, protection turned into extortion, and loyalty turned into fear. The very word Mafia comes from Sicily in the 19th century, where distrust of the state ran so deep that locals turned to their own networks of family and clan. Over time, these networks transformed into a parallel power system, a shadow authority that rivaled the government itself. Sicily, isolated and poor, was the perfect breeding ground for organized crime. In a land where law enforcement was weak, the Mafia built its empire on two principles: omerta, the code of silence, and pisotha, tax of fear. Shopkeepers, farmers, and businesses all paid the Mafia not to be harmed. If you refused, you weren't just risking your business, you were risking your life. By the late 1800s, the Mafia wasn't just a gang. It was a shadow government. It controlled land, dictated business, and even influenced politics. Police and judges often looked the other way because they were paid to, or because they feared the consequences if they didn't. But Sicily was just the beginning. The Mafia had bigger ambitions. And when millions of Italians migrated to America, the Mafia followed them across the ocean. The rise in America then came the 1920s Prohibition. The United States banned alcohol, but people still wanted to drink. The Mafia saw opportunity. Bootlegging speakeasies and smuggling operations turned small-time gangs into multi-million-dollar empires. Figures like Al Capone became household names, not just because of their brutality, but because of their wealth and influence. By the time Prohibition ended, the Mafia had become a permanent fixture of American life. They had infiltrated unions, businesses, and even politics. They no longer needed to fight in the streets to gain power. They controlled entire industries from behind the scenes. The code and the culture. What made the Mafia different from ordinary criminals was its culture. It wasn't just a gang, it was a family. The code of omerta demanded absolute silence. Betrayal was punished with death, no matter who you were. Blood ties and sworn loyalty created an unbreakable network of trust. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, respect, and survival. In many ways, the Mafia operated like a corporation. It had ranks, from foot soldiers to capos, underbosses, and the all-powerful boss. Every level had duties. Every crime was part of a larger business plan. And just like corporations, they expanded into new markets: gambling, drugs, construction, waste management, anything that could make money and keep the machine alive. By the mid-20th century, the Mafia was no longer confined to Sicily or the United States. It had become a global network. In Japan, the Yakuza controlled entire neighborhoods with rituals as strict as the samurai. In China, the triads ruled with secret societies and coded traditions. In Latin America, drug cartels emerged as the new kings of organized crime, turning entire nations into battlefields for power. Different cultures, different rituals, different names, but the same DNA: fear, money, and loyalty. The Mafia's origins may have been soaked in blood, but its future would be built on business. From street corners to skyscrapers, from gambling dens to boardrooms, organized crime discovered that violence draws attention, but money buys silence. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Mafia transformed from street thugs into businessmen, how they built billion-dollar industries, infiltrated corporations, and even shaped national economies. The streets gave them power, but the markets gave them an empire. From streets to states, the Mafia's business empire. When most people think of the Mafia, they picture smoky backrooms, hidden guns, and blood spilled in the streets. But the true genius of organized crime wasn't in the violence, it was in the business. Violence was only the beginning. What gave the Mafia real power was its ability to transform chaos into profit, to run entire industries like corporations, and to quietly build an empire that governments struggled to fight. From protection rackets to real business. In its earliest days, the Mafia's money came from protection rackets, forcing small businesses to pay for safety. But soon, they realized something. Why just skim off businesses when you could own them? Construction companies, shipping firms, restaurants, casinos, there was money to be made. The Mafia wanted in. In New York, the Mafia infiltrated labor unions. They controlled the docks, the construction sites, and even the garbage industry. Every building razed, every truck unloaded, every street cleaned could mean money flowing into mafia pockets. And it didn't stop there. The mafia had leverage over politicians who needed the support of union bosses, and this gave them influence not just over businesses, but over entire cities. The golden age of gambling and vice gambling became one of the mafia's greatest cash machines. From illegal card games in basements to glittering casinos in Las Vegas, the mafia built an empire of vice. Las Vegas in the mid-20th century was practically a mafia project. Casinos financed by mob bosses, skim operations stealing millions before taxes, and glamorous shows masking a brutal underworld. And wherever there was gambling, there was also drugs, prostitution, and loan sharking. People wanted excitement, and the mafia was ready to sell it to them for a price that often cost them their lives. The drug trade, but the true turning point for the mafia's fortune was drugs. Starting with heroin smuggling in the 1950s and 60s, and later cocaine in the 70s and 80s, drugs turned criminal groups into global corporations. Networks stretched from the poppy fields of Asia to the streets of New York. Colombian cartels partnered with Italian and American mafias. Mexican gangs built distribution empires that still dominate today. Drugs were risky, but they were unbelievably profitable. A single shipment could generate millions in cash. And with that money came more influence. Corrupt politicians bought police officers, and communities too scared to resist. Money laundering and corporate crime, but with great profits came a problem. Where do you put the money? Walking into a bank with a suitcase full of cash is a one-way ticket to suspicion. And so, the mafia became masters of money laundering. Through shell companies, offshore accounts, real estate, and later cryptocurrencies. They cleaned dirty money and fed it back into the global economy. Banks, sometimes willingly, sometimes blindly, played a role. Massive scandals like the Panama Papers revealed just how deep organized crime had burrowed into the financial system. The mafia didn't just survive globalization, they thrived on it. Political influence, and then there was politics. With money and fear, the mafia bought influence. In Sicily, they infiltrated local governments. In America, they funded politicians who turned a blind eye. In Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mafia practically merged with politics, creating oligarchs whose power rivaled entire states. Organized crime wasn't just a shadow force, it was sometimes indistinguishable from the government itself. Global case studies consider the Yakuza in Japan. Unlike the secretive Sicilian Mafia, the Yakuza operated openly, with offices, business cards, and corporate fronts. They invested in construction, entertainment, and even the stock market. In China, triads expanded into smuggling and technology piracy. In Mexico and Colombia, cartels became so powerful they could challenge entire governments with armies of their own. Each of these groups was different in culture and style, but all followed the same formula: diversify, invest, launder, and expand. By the end of the 20th century, the mafia was no longer just a gang. It was a multinational corporation. From drug empires to construction firms, from Las Vegas casinos to offshore accounts in Panama, organized crime had embedded itself into the global economy. Violence was still a tool, but money had become the real weapon. But the story doesn't end there. Because in the 21st century, the mafia faced new opportunities and new challenges. Globalization, the internet, cryptocurrencies, and even climate change opened fresh markets for crime. And as governments struggled to keep up, the mafia quietly adapted. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how organized crime evolved into an invisible empire that shapes the modern world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The invisible empire, the mafia in the 21st century. The mafia, you imagine the guns, the gang wars, the smoky back rooms, That mafia is gone. Today's mafia doesn't need machine guns to dominate. They have laptops, offshore accounts, and armies of lawyers. They, Dante, need to intimidate you in person. They can steal your money while sitting in another country. Welcome to the 21st century, where organized crime has transformed into something far more dangerous. An invisible empire woven into the fabric of our global economy. The digital revolution of crime, when the internet exploded in the 1990s and 2000s. Governments celebrated a new age of information. But the mafia saw something else, an opportunity. Online fraud, credit card scams, identity thefts. Suddenly, you didn't need guns to rob someone. All you needed was a computer screen. Russian cybercriminals pioneered hacking groups that siphoned billions from banks worldwide. The Italian Mafia invested in online gambling platforms, laundering dirty money through legitimately websites. Chinese triads moved into digital piracy, selling counterfeit software and movies worth billions. Cybercrime became the new drug trade, low risk, high reward, and almost impossible to trace. In 2021 alone, global cybercrime damages were estimated at over $6 trillion, and much of it flows through networks connected to organized crimes, cryptocurrency, and dark markets. Then came cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was hailed as the future of finance, but for the mafia, it was the perfect laundering tool. Anonymous transactions, decentralized exchanges, and digital wallets became the new offshore bank accounts. Darknet marketplaces like Silk Road and Hydra became hubs where drugs, weapons, and even assassinations could be bought with crypto. Law enforcement shut some down, but new ones always appeared. The mafia had gone digital, borderless, invisible, and unregulated. Global expansion of old mafias. But make no mistake, the old mafias didn't disappear. They adapted. The Sicilian Mafia, Camorra, and 'Ndrangheta now control global cocaine trafficking, working hand in hand with South American cartels. The Yakuza in Japan shifted focus to real estate, entertainment, and even disaster relief contracts after earthquakes. In Russia, organized crime fused with oligarchs and government, making it nearly impossible to tell where the state ends and the mafia begins. Today's mafias are more global than ever, stretching across continents, operating like corporations, with networks more resilient than governments themselves. New frontiers, environment, medicine, and migration in the 21st century. Organized crime discovered new industries to exploit. One of them was the environment. Illegal logging, toxic waste dumping, and wildlife trafficking became billion-dollar industries. In Italy, the mafia profited from dumping hazardous waste in rural lands. In Africa, poaching networks fueled global black markets in ivory and rare species. Another frontier was medicine. During the COVID-19 pandemic, fake vaccines, counterfeit masks, and black market medical supplies flooded the world, much of it linked to organized crime. And then there's human migration. Smuggling migrants across borders has become one of the fastest-growing criminal businesses, generating billions every year. Vulnerable people fleeing wars or poverty are turned into commodities, sold seats on dangerous boats, or trapped in networks of modern slavery. Political influence and corruption. But the mafia's most frightening evolution is its political influence. Cartels in Mexico openly fight wars against the state. In Eastern Europe, oligarchs with criminal ties sit in parliament. In some African nations, warlords and criminal networks control resources more effectively than governments. This isn't just organized crime anymore, it's organized power. The line between state and syndicate has blurred in ways that make true accountability nearly impossible. Case studies take the 'Ndrangheta of Italy. Once seen as rural gangsters, today they're considered the most powerful mafia in the world. controlling up to 80% of Europe's cocaine trade. They have invested in luxury hotels, stock markets, and global companies. Their reach is so vast that Europol calls them a multinational with a criminal soul, or the Mexican cartels, whose revenues rival Fortune 500 companies. With private armies, armored vehicles, and even drones, they wage war against entire states, sometimes winning. Then there's the Russian Mafia, embedded in everything from energy companies to arms smuggling. Experts warn their influence stretches far into Western Europe and even the United States, making them less of a gang and more of a shadow state. The mafia of today isn't the mafia of yesterday. It's bigger, richer, and harder to fight. It exists in cyberspace, in offshore accounts, in parliaments, and in corporations. It thrives on globalization, technology, and corruption. And while the world sees organized crime as a shadow, the truth is this: the shadow now overlaps with the system itself. This is the invisible empire of the 21st century, an empire without borders, without faces, and without fear. And the question we must all ask is simple. If the mafia has already become a global empire, who is truly in control? The governments we elect, or the criminals we cannot see?